The snow fell in a silent, determined curtain, erasing the world one flake at a time. It clung to the pines until their branches bowed, and it buried the tracks May had made only an hour before. Her breath plumed in the frigid air, a fleeting ghost against the vast, unforgiving white of the Montana winter. In her hands, the cold steel of the rifle was a familiar weight, a stark reality in a life stripped down to its barest essentials: warmth, food, and solitude. Her light pink prairie dress, a relic from a different life, was worn thin beneath her heavy wool coat, its color a fragile defiance against the monochrome landscape. She was hunting not for sport but for survival, for the morsel of meat that would see her through the next blizzard. It was then that she saw it, a stain of darkness against the snow, a disruption in the perfect, desolate canvas. Her first thought was of a wolf or a bear, but the shape was wrong. It was a man, sprawled and unmoving, a dark patch spreading slowly from his leg, melting the snow around it into a grim, pinkish slush. Caution warred with a deeper, more stubborn instinct. Her late husband Chin had always said her heart was too soft for this harsh land, a flaw that would one day be her undoing. She crept closer, the rifle held ready. The man was large, dressed in clothes that spoke of wealth even when torn and bloodied. A thick shearling coat, fine leather boots, one of which was ruined, soaked through with blood. He was alive, his breathing shallow and ragged. His face, pale with pain and cold, was framed by dark hair dusted with snow. He was a stranger, and a stranger in these parts was a risk she could not afford. Leaving him was the sensible choice. The storm was worsening, and dragging a man of his size back to her cabin would drain what little strength she had. But as she watched a tremor run through his body, a primal shudder against the encroaching deathly cold, Chin's voice echoed, not in warning, but in memory. He had been a good man, a kind man. He would not have left another soul to perish. May lowered the rifle and knelt beside the stranger, her gloved fingers gently brushing the snow from his face. His eyes fluttered open, a flicker of deep blue clouded with agony. He tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper escaped. "Please." The word was a fragile thread in the immense silence. In that moment, the decision was no longer a choice. It was a duty. With a grunt of exertion, she looped her arms under his, her small frame straining against his dead weight. The journey back was a torment of burning lungs and screaming muscles, a desperate crawl against the rising tide of the blizzard. Each step was a battle, the man's unconscious body a leaden anchor. But as the first light of her cabin's window pierced the swirling snow, a tiny, flickering beacon of hope, she knew she had not been undone by her softness. She had been defined by it. Inside the small one-room cabin, the fire crackled a defiant song against the howling wind. The warmth was a balm, chasing the deep chill from May's bones as she worked. She had managed to haul the stranger onto her cot, his long frame overwhelming the small bed. Cutting away the ruined fabric of his trousers revealed the source of the bleeding, a vicious wound in his thigh, raw and angry. It was a gunshot wound, clean through but festering from the cold. For hours she moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency that belied the turmoil in her heart. She boiled water, sterilizing the small knife her husband had left her. She cleaned the wound with a sharp intake of breath, her touch gentle but firm as she extracted fragments of cloth and dirt. The man groaned, his body arching in a wave of feverish pain, but he did not wake. May ground herbs into a paste, yarrow to staunch the bleeding, willow bark for the fever, and applied it with careful fingers before binding the leg tightly with strips of clean linen. The intimacy of the act was not lost on her. Her hands, which had known only the familiar contours of her husband's body, now tended to the broken flesh of a complete stranger. As she worked, she studied him. His face, now cleaned of grime and blood, was handsome in a rugged, angular way. Lines of hardship were etched around his eyes, yet there was a strength in the set of his jaw that even unconsciousness could not erase. His hands were large and calloused, the hands of a man who worked, despite the fine quality of his clothes. He was a paradox, and he was now her responsibility. By the time the wound was dressed, exhaustion was a heavy cloak on her shoulders. She sank onto the small stool by the hearth, watching the rise and fall of his chest. The blizzard raged outside, sealing the men together, a tiny island of warmth and fragile life in a sea of frozen wilderness. Who was he? What trouble had found him in this desolate place? The questions were a low hum beneath her fatigue. She had invited danger into her home, a danger far greater than any winter storm. Yet, as she looked at him, sleeping a fitful, feverish sleep, she felt not fear, but a strange, protective resolve. She had pulled him from the snow's embrace. She would not let him go now. He finally woke 2 days later. May was stirring a thin rabbit stew over the fire when she heard a low groan. She turned, her heart quickening. His blue eyes were open, clearer now, and fixed on her. They held a guarded, questioning light. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. "You're safe," she replied softly, her voice accented but clear. She ladled some broth into a bowl and brought it to him. "You were in the snow. I found you." He tried to sit up, a sharp hiss of pain stopping him. He looked down at his bandaged leg, a flicker of memory crossing his face. "Shot," he muttered. "Ambushed." He looked back at her, his gaze intense. "Who are you?" "My name is May," she said, offering the bowl. "Drink this. It will help with the fever." He hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching hers, looking for a threat. He found none. With a nod, he took the bowl, his large hands trembling slightly as he drank. The silence in the cabin was thick with unspoken questions, with the vast differences that lay between them. She was a poor Chinese widow, hidden away from a world that had not been kind to her. He was something else entirely. But in that small, shared moment, as the storm howled its lonely song outside, they were simply two survivors, bound by a wound and an act of kindness. Weeks bled into one another, marked only by the rhythm of the changing winter light outside the cabin's single window. Nathaniel, he had told her his name on the third day, began to heal. The fever broke, and the raw anger of his wound slowly subsided into a dull, persistent ache. He remained weak, his leg useless, but the life that had flickered so precariously was now a steady flame. Their days fell into a quiet routine. May would tend to her snares in the early morning, her rifle a constant companion, returning with whatever meager game the forest offered. She would cook, mend, and tend to his bandages, her movements economical and graceful. Nathaniel would watch her, a silent observer from the cot. He learned the landscape of her face, the quiet determination in her dark eyes, the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the rare, fleeting smile that transformed her features with a light that humbled him. He spoke little of his past, and she did not press. She understood that some wounds were not visible. She, too, carried her own. Her husband, Chin, had brought her here to build a life away from the prejudice of the towns, but a sudden sickness had stolen him a year ago, leaving her utterly alone. "You are very skilled," Nathaniel said one afternoon, his voice startling her as she ground herbs with a stone pestle. "With medicines. My father would have paid a fortune for a healer like you." May paused, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. "My grandmother taught me. She said the mountains provide everything we need if we know where to look." "She was a wise woman," he said, his gaze lingering on her. A comfortable silence settled between them, a language they were both beginning to understand. It was a language of shared glances, of small gestures, The way he'd try to shift his weight to make her task of changing his dressing easier. The way she'd place an extra piece of wood on the fire when she noticed him shivering. But their fragile peace was destined to be broken. One afternoon, the sound of hoofbeats thundered through the snow-muffled quiet. May froze, her hand instinctively going to the rifle propped against the wall. She peered through the window. 2 riders were approaching, their figures stark against the white. They were headed directly for her cabin. "Get down," she whispered to Nathaniel, her voice tight with urgency. "Stay out of sight." The lead rider was a man with a cruel, thin face and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He reined in his horse a few yards from her door, his gaze sweeping over the small cabin with dismissive contempt. This was Alistair Finch, a man whose name was spoken in whispers in the nearest town, a land baron who consumed smaller homesteads like a wolf consumes sheep. "Well, well," Finch called out, his voice slick with false cordiality. "What have we here?" "A little prairie flower bloomin' in the middle of nowhere." May stepped outside, the rifle held loosely but purposefully in her hands. "This is my home. State your business." Finch's smile didn't reach his cold eyes. "My business is this land. All of it. I have a claim filed in Helena. Seems you're squatting, little lady." "This was my husband's land," she stated, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We have papers." "Papers can get lost," he sneered, "just like people." His eyes roamed over her, an invasive, predatory look that made her skin crawl. "A woman alone out here, it's not safe. You should consider selling. I'd be generous." Inside, Nathaniel listened, every muscle in his body tensing with a rage he could not act upon. He was helpless, a caged lion, as this vulture circled the one person who had shown him kindness. He heard May's reply, her voice ringing with a strength that both astonished and terrified him. "I am not selling. This is my home. Now leave." For a long moment, Finch just stared at her. Then, with a chillingly soft laugh, he turned his horse. "We'll see," he said, the words a clear threat. "We will see." As the riders disappeared into the trees, May leaned against the rough-hewn door frame, her knuckles white on the rifle stock. The sanctuary she had so carefully built had been breached. The outside world, with all its greed and cruelty, had found her. The encounter with Alistair Finch left a chilling residue in the small cabin, an unspoken tension that clung to the air like wood smoke. May grew more watchful, her eyes constantly scanning the tree line, the rifle never far from her reach. The fragile peace they had cultivated was gone, replaced by the grim reality of the threat that now loomed over them. That evening, as May added another log to the fire, Nathaniel broke the heavy silence. "He's the one," he said, his voice low and hard. "Finch. His men are the ones who ambushed me. I was on my way back from the land office in Helena, securing the titles to the northern pastures. He's been trying to claim them for years." The revelation landed between them, heavy and sharp. This was not a random act of cruelty. It was a calculated attack, and she was now caught in the middle of it. She looked at him, seeing not just the wounded man she had rescued, but a figure at the center of a dangerous conflict. "Who are you, Nathaniel?" she asked softly, the question she had held back for weeks. He met her gaze, his blue eyes holding a deep weariness, but also an unyielding resolve. "My name is Nathaniel Blackwood. I own the Blackwood Ranch in the valley south of here." May knew the name. It was spoken of as a kingdom, a vast expanse of land and cattle run by a family that had shaped the territory. It was a world away from her own. The knowledge settled uneasily within her. She had saved not just a man, but a magnate, a pillar of this wild country. The gulf between their stations suddenly felt immense, an impassable chasm. "He wants your land," she murmured, understanding dawning. "And now he thinks he can take mine, too." "He won't," Nathaniel said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. He pushed himself up, his jaw tight with effort and pain, propping himself on his elbows. His eyes locked with hers, and in them she saw a fire that matched the one in the hearth. "May, listen to me. This man Finch, he preys on those he thinks are weak, those he believes are alone. But you are not alone. Not anymore." He reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on the rough-spun blanket. His touch was warm and firm, a current of strength passing between them. "I owe you my life. I will not let him harm you. I give you my word. When I can stand on my own 2 feet, I will protect you. No one will ever threaten you or this home again." His promise was a vow, spoken with the weight of a man who did not make such declarations lightly. In his eyes, she saw more than gratitude. She saw respect, admiration, and something deeper, something that mirrored the burgeoning warmth in her own chest. She had spent the last year grieving, her heart a frozen landscape much like the winter outside. But in this small cabin, in the presence of this determined, honorable man, she felt the first tentative signs of a thaw. The fear of Finch was real, a cold knot in her stomach, but Nathaniel's promise was a shield against it. She turned her hand over, her slender fingers lacing with his. "I am not afraid," she said, and was surprised to find it was the truth. They were 2 solitary souls, a reclusive widow and a wounded rancher, brought together by violence and chance. But in that moment, their hands clasped in the flickering firelight, they were a fortress. Finch did not wait long. A week later he returned, not with the quiet menace of his previous visit, but with the loud, arrogant authority of a man convinced of his own power. He brought with him the town sheriff, a portly man with a weary face who looked distinctly uncomfortable with the proceedings. Finch held up a piece of paper, waving it like a victory flag. "As I told you, ma'am," he announced, his voice carrying on the crisp winter air, "official eviction notice, signed and sealed by the circuit judge. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises." May stood in the doorway, her face pale but her spine rigid. "This is my property. The deed is in my husband's name." "A deed that is apparently invalid," Finch said with a dismissive shrug. "A clerical error, they say. The land was part of my original parcel purchase all along. A terrible shame." The sheriff cleared his throat, avoiding May's gaze. "Ma'am, I'm just here to enforce the order. I don't want any trouble." It was a lie, a carefully constructed trap, and they all knew it. Finch's influence ran deep, his money buying signatures and turning blind eyes. May felt a wave of despair wash over her. How could she fight this? A lone Chinese woman against a man who could bend the law to his will? Just as Finch was about to press his advantage, a new voice cut through the tension, cold and sharp as splintered ice. "You're a long way from your territory, Finch." Nathaniel stood in the doorway behind May, leaning heavily on a crude crutch he had fashioned from a sturdy branch. His face was drawn with pain, but his eyes burned with a cold fury. He had pulled on his shirt and trousers, and though he was still a shadow of his full strength, his presence was commanding. Finch's jaw dropped. He stared, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. "Blackwood," he spat, the name a curse. "What in God's name are you doing here?" "Enjoying the hospitality of a friend," Nathaniel replied, his voice dangerously even. "A friend whose land you seem to be mistaken about. And this woman," he added, his gaze softening for a moment as he looked at May before turning back to Finch with renewed fire, "is under my protection." The sheriff's eyes widened. The name Blackwood carried more weight than any forged document Finch could produce. He suddenly looked less like an officer of the law and more like a man who had made a catastrophic miscalculation. This is a legal matter, Mr. Blackwood," the sheriff stammered. Then it will be settled legally, Nathaniel countered, but not like this, not by intimidating a woman in her own home. You will take that piece of paper, and you will take your hired snake, and you will get off this property. Now. The command was absolute. Finch's face contorted with fury. He had been so close. To be thwarted by the very man he thought he'd left for dead in the snow was an unbearable humiliation. He shot a look of pure venom at May, a look that promised retribution. "This isn't over, Blackwood," he snarled, snatching the paper from the sheriff's hand. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his henchman following close behind. The sheriff lingered for a moment, tipping his hat awkwardly. "My apologies, ma'am. Mr. Blackwood?" He turned and rode off, eager to distance himself from the mess. The sudden quiet was deafening. May turned to Nathaniel, her heart pounding. The sheer force of his will had been a physical presence. He swayed slightly, his face ashen with the effort of standing. She rushed to his side, helping him back to the cot. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered, her voice thick with a mixture of fear and overwhelming gratitude. "You're not strong enough." He sank onto the cot, his breathing ragged. He looked up at her, a faint, weary smile touching his lips. "I am strong enough for that," he said. "For you." The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was their shared ground, the place where they had drawn a line in the snow and dared their enemy to cross it. And in the aftermath of the battle, the space between them shimmered with a new and potent intensity. The immediate threat had passed, but the air in the cabin remained thick with a sense of impending conflict. They both knew Finch would not be so easily defeated. He would regroup, find another angle of attack. The confrontation had solidified their alliance, binding them together not just as rescuer and victim, but as partners in a shared fight. Nathaniel, driven by a new urgency, pushed his recovery relentlessly. Every day he practiced walking, first with the crutch, then without, his face a mask of grim determination as he forced his wounded leg to bear his weight. May watched him, her heart aching at his pain but soaring at his resolve. In the evenings, the tension of the day would melt away in the warm glow of the firelight. They talked for hours, filling the small space with stories of their pasts. He told her of his family, of building his ranch from nothing but a dream and a stretch of wild land. She in turn spoke of her life in a distant province in China, of her arranged marriage to Chen, and of their journey across the ocean in search of a life where they could breathe free. "He was a good man," she said softly, her gaze lost in the flames. "He wanted to build a home here, a place where no one could look down on us." "He succeeded," Nathaniel said, his voice gentle. "He built a home that was strong enough to save a stranger's life." His words were a balm to a wound she hadn't realized was still so raw. He didn't just see her as a woman. He saw her history, her strength, the legacy of love she carried. One evening, to distract them from the waiting, he found a worn pack of playing cards in his saddlebag, which she had salvaged and dried by the fire. "Do you know how to play gin?" he asked, a playful glint in his eye. She shook her head. "My husband said cards were a tool for idle hands." "Well," Nathaniel smiled, "my hands are decidedly idle. Allow me to corrupt you." He taught her the game, his large hands patiently guiding hers, explaining the rules with a quiet humor that made her laugh. The sound of her own laughter felt foreign and wonderful. As he dealt the cards, his fingers brushed against hers, sending a jolt of warmth through her. The air shifted, the simple card game becoming something more, a delicate dance of proximity and unspoken feelings. He paused, his hand still covering hers. He looked at her, his expression serious now, the laughter gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, stirring tenderness. "You have more courage in your heart than any man I've ever known, May," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You face down blizzards and armed men, and you do it with a quiet grace that takes my breath away." He leaned closer, his gaze dropping to her lips. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them, the crackling of the fire and the frantic beating of her own heart the only sounds. He hesitated, his eyes asking a question she answered with a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He closed the distance, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both tentative and deeply certain. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound recognition, a silent acknowledgment of the bond that had been forged between them in the heart of the winter storm. When they broke apart, the cabin was filled with a new, beautiful silence. The threat of Finch still lingered outside, but within these four walls, something fragile and powerful had finally bloomed. Nathaniel knew that Finch's next move would be to turn the community against May. A direct assault had failed. Now he would resort to poison. "He'll use the town," Nathaniel explained one morning, his face grim as he paced the length of the cabin, his limp less pronounced with each passing day. "He'll paint you as a foreigner, a trespasser, someone dangerous. It's a coward's tactic, but it's effective." He needed to get a message to his own people, to his ranch. Their only link to the outside world was a solitary old trapper named Silas who passed through the area every few weeks. They watched and waited, and when Silas's familiar figure finally appeared on the distant ridge, Nathaniel met him, pressing a sealed letter and a gold coin into the man's hand with a quiet urgency. "This must get to my foreman, Henry, at the Blackwood Ranch. It's a matter of life and death." With the message sent, all they could do was wait for the storm Finch was surely gathering. It broke 2 weeks later. It wasn't a blizzard of snow, but of people. A small posse led by Finch and the town sheriff rode up to the cabin. They were accompanied by a dozen townsfolk, their faces a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and hostility. Finch had done his work well. "May," the sheriff called out, his voice strained. "There's been an accusation. Mr. Finch here claims you're harboring a fugitive, a man wanted for rustling and claim jumping." The lie was so audacious it was almost laughable, yet the faces of the townspeople were deadly serious. Finch sat on his horse, a smug, triumphant look on his face. He had twisted the narrative completely, casting Nathaniel as the villain and himself as the protector of the community. May stepped out of the cabin, her rifle held at her side. She would not be intimidated. "There is no fugitive here," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Only a man you tried to murder, Mr. Finch." A murmur went through the crowd. Before Finch could retort, Nathaniel appeared behind her. He walked without his crutch now, each step deliberate and firm. He stood beside May, a silent, unshakable pillar of support. "My name is Nathaniel Blackwood," he said, his voice projecting across the snow-covered clearing. "And Alistair Finch is a liar and a would-be murderer." Finch laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "The ravings of a desperate criminal. Sheriff, do your duty." The sheriff, caught between two powerful men, looked uncertain. He was about to speak when a new sound reached them, the thunder of many hoofbeats. Over the rise came a group of at least 20 riders, moving with purpose. At their head was a tall, weathered man with a steady gaze. Henry, the Blackwood foreman. They fanned out, creating a formidable line behind Nathaniel and May, their presence shifting the balance of power instantly. Henry dismounted, carrying a leather satchel. "Nathaniel," he said with a nod. He turned to the crowd. "We heard some troubling rumors. Thought we'd come set the record straight." He opened the satchel and pulled out a sheaf of documents. "These are the official deeds to the northern pastures, filed and stamped in Helena by Judge Miller himself. The ones Mr. Blackwood was carrying when he was ambushed." He then produced a second document. "And this," he said, his voice ringing with authority, "is a signed confession from one of the men Finch hired for that ambush, a man named Peterson. He got scared, see? Said he never signed on for murder." A collective gasp went through the crowd. All eyes turned to Finch. His smug expression had vanished, replaced by the pale, clammy look of a man trapped. "Lies! All of it!" he sputtered. but his denial was weak, his panic palpable. The townspeople looked from the irrefutable proof in Henry's hand to the cornered look on Finch's face, and the truth settled upon them, stark and undeniable. They had been manipulated, their fears and prejudices used as a weapon by a greedy, ruthless man. The crowd's suspicion now turned to anger, directed squarely at the man who had deceived them. The tide of public opinion turned with the brutal finality of an avalanche. The whispers of the crowd grew into angry murmurs, their gazes, once hostile towards May, now fixed on Alistair Finch with contempt. He was no longer a powerful landowner. He was a common villain, exposed and disgraced in front of the very people he sought to control. The sheriff, seeing the undeniable proof and the shift in the crowd, finally found his courage. He drew his pistol, though his hand trembled slightly. "Alistair Finch," he declared, his voice louder than anyone had ever heard it, "you're under arrest for attempted murder and fraud." Finch's face was a mask of disbelief. He looked from the sheriff to the stony faces of the Blackwood riders, then to the accusing eyes of the townsfolk. There was no escape. His power, built on a foundation of lies and intimidation, had crumbled to dust in a matter of minutes. As two of Nathaniel's men disarmed a sputtering Finch and tied his hands, the rest of the crowd began to disperse, shamefaced and quiet. A few of the townsfolk, a blacksmith and his wife among them, approached May hesitantly. "Ma'am," the blacksmith said, twisting his hat in his hands, We're sorry. We should have known better than to listen to a man like that." May simply nodded, her expression unreadable. She had not sought their approval, only their absence. Her victory was not in their apology, but in the quiet strength she had found within herself. Nathaniel thanked Henry with a firm handshake and a look that conveyed more than words ever could. As the Blackwood riders escorted the sheriff and his prisoner back toward town, a profound quiet descended once more upon the clearing. The snow seemed cleaner, the air purer. The storm had finally and truly passed. May and Nathaniel were left alone, standing before the small cabin that had been their sanctuary and their battleground. He turned to her, his face weary but his eyes full of a deep, abiding emotion. "It's over," he said softly. She let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The tension that had been a constant companion for weeks finally drained away, leaving her feeling light, almost weightless. "Thank you, Nathaniel," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears, "for keeping your promise." "It was a promise I was honored to keep," he replied. He took a step closer, taking her hands in his. They were small and delicate, yet they were the hands that had cleaned his wound, fed him, and held a rifle with unwavering courage. "This cabin saved my life," he began, his voice low and earnest. "But it's you who saved me, May. You saved me from more than just the cold. You reminded me what it means to fight for something, to care for someone." He paused, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "I don't want to imagine a life without you in it. I look at my ranch, all that land, all those rooms in that big house, and I realize it's all been empty. It's been a place, but it hasn't been a home." His gaze held hers, his blue eyes clear and full of sincerity. "I'm asking you to leave this place of survival behind. I'm asking you to build a new life with me, to be my wife." The proposal was so simple, so direct, stripped of all pretense. He wasn't offering her his wealth or his name as a prize. He was offering her his heart, a partnership, a place of belonging. Tears finally welled in her eyes and traced paths down her cheeks. But they were tears of joy, of release, of a hope she had thought long buried. May looked at the man before her, the millionaire rancher who had come into her life as a broken stranger. He was offering her a future she had never dared to dream of, a world of comfort and security. But that was not what made her heart swell with a profound and certain yes. It was the look in his eyes. the one that saw her not as a fragile prairie flower or an exotic curiosity, but as an equal, a woman of strength and substance. It was the respect in his voice, the tenderness in his touch. He had seen all of her, the grieving widow, the lonely survivor, the fierce protector, and he had loved every part. Her life with Chin had been one of quiet love and shared hardship, a partnership built on necessity and gentle affection. What she felt for Nathaniel was different. It was a fire forged in crisis that promised not just comfort, but a vibrant, soaring warmth. "Yes," she whispered, the word feeling both momentous and completely natural. "Yes, Nathaniel, I will marry you." A smile of pure, unadulterated joy transformed his face, erasing the last lines of pain and weariness. He wrapped his arms around her, lifting her off her feet in an exuberant embrace. She laughed, a sound of pure, unburdened happiness that echoed through the silent pines. The next day they prepared to leave the cabin. Packing her few belongings took very little time. There was a small collection of Chin's books, her mother's jade pendant, and the worn wool blankets that had kept her warm through the long, lonely winter. Each item was a memory, a piece of the life she was now leaving behind. As she folded her light pink prairie dress, the one she had worn the day she found him, Nathaniel came to stand beside her. He gently took the dress from her hands and folded it with a reverence that touched her deeply. "You should keep this," he said. "It's the color of the dawn." He was right. It was the color of a new beginning. She looked around the small, rough-hewn room one last time. It had been a shelter from the world's cruelty, a place of deep grief, and ultimately the crucible where her new life had been forged. It would always be a part of her story. They left the cabin door unlocked, a silent offering of shelter to any other soul who might find themselves lost in the wilderness. The journey to the Blackwood Ranch was a revelation. They rode through vast, rolling hills and wide open valleys under a brilliant blue sky. The sheer scale of his land was breathtaking. When the ranch house finally came into view, a sprawling but elegant structure of dark timber and river stone nestled in a grove of cottonwoods, May felt a pang of apprehension. This world was so much grander than her own. But Nathaniel, sensing her unease, squeezed her hand. "It's just wood and stone, May," he said softly. "A home is the people inside it." He was met at the door by a kind-faced, gray-haired woman with warm eyes. "Mrs. Gable, this is May," Nathaniel said, his voice filled with pride. "My future wife." The housekeeper's face broke into a genuine, welcoming smile. "We are so pleased to finally meet the woman who saved our Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice kind. "Welcome home, ma'am." In that moment, May's fears dissolved. This was not a castle where she would be an outsider. It was a place waiting to be filled with life and love. It was a place she could truly belong. Their wedding took place 2 weeks later, as the last of the winter snow melted away, revealing the first green shoots of spring. It was not the grand affair the territory might have expected from a man of Nathaniel Blackwood's stature. Instead, it was an intimate ceremony held in the main room of the ranch house, before the great stone fireplace that now roared with warmth and welcome. The guests were few but significant. Henry was there, standing beside Nathaniel as his witness, his weathered face beaming with pride. Mrs. Gable stood with May, her comforting presence a source of quiet strength. The blacksmith and his wife had made the long journey from town, their attendance a symbol of the community's mended faith. A traveling preacher, his face kind and his words simple, presided over the ceremony. May wore a new dress, a simple gown of deep blue silk that Nathaniel had ordered for her, but around her neck she wore her mother's jade pendant. It was a link to her past, a reminder of the journey that had brought her to this incredible moment. Nathaniel stood tall and proud, his limp barely noticeable. He wore a fine suit, but his eyes were not on his guests or his surroundings. They were fixed on May, and in them she saw a universe of love, gratitude, and devotion. When it was time for their vows, they did not speak words written in a book. They spoke from the heart, their promises forged in the fire of shared adversity. "I found you half dead in the snow," May began, her voice soft but clear. "I tended your wounds to save your life, but in healing you, I healed myself. I promised to be your partner, your shelter, and your home for all my days." Nathaniel took her hands, his grip firm and steady. "You came to me as an angel in a blizzard, May. You fought for me when I could not fight for myself. You showed me what true strength and courage are. I promise to honor you, to protect you, and to love you with every breath I have until my last." The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and as Nathaniel kissed her, the room filled with the warm, heartfelt applause of their small group of friends. It was a perfect moment, a quiet culmination of a journey that had started in desperation and ended in a love that felt as vast and enduring as the land around them. Later that evening, they stood on the veranda, looking out as the sun set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and gold. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, the promise of spring. Nathaniel wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Are you happy, Mrs. Blackwood?" he whispered, his lips against her hair. May leaned her head against his shoulder, a feeling of profound peace settling deep within her soul. She thought of the small, lonely cabin in the woods, of the howling wind and the endless white. She had survived that. She had faced down greed and prejudice and had emerged not just unscathed, but stronger. She had not been rescued from her old life. She had built a new one on her own terms, with a man who saw and cherished her for exactly who she was. "I am more than happy," she said, her gaze on the horizon where the last light of day was giving way to a sky full of stars. "I am home."